Where the Redstone Awaits, Emplacement and Economics in Semiotically Rich Hunter-Gatherer Landscapes. I am Chester Levosh, and this paper is an outgrowth of my earlier attempts to engage with Southern Numic economic systems. I argue that an understanding of indigenous ontology is necessary for this discussion because it provides a time-space systematics in which exchange is situated and descriptions of the other-than-human agents who are also seen as economic agents in this system. Stratified biomes of the Mojave Desert inspired chromatically rich indigenous topology. Foragers of the Numic Heartland navigated manifold, in the topological sense, seasonal rounds through multi-tiered worlds rich in guiding semiotic indicators. I will eschew the Western terms of resources and extraction that might be applied by other economic approaches and avoid placing these statically in a singular Cartesian world. Instead, this paper considers discursive exchanges between human and non-human agents situated in a many-worlds cosmology in cyclical motion. Thusly reframed, transfers of materials as well as of immaterial puha required emplacement, facilitated by environmental observations, cultural deposits, and anthropogenic inscriptions. Archaeological evidence is reinterpreted through this ethnographically inspired phenomenological framework to illuminate semiotic mediation of hunter-gatherer economics and ontology. To provide a roadmap of where we'll be going here, the waypoints begin with confronting some unfortunate myths describing the Numic peoples as gastric and devoid of symbolism. Thank you very much, Julian Stewart. Next, we'll be recapping the Mount Charleston topology, which many of you will already be familiar with, and then moving on to discussing economy as a practice of negotiated interactions. We'll be taking some inspiration from the works of Marcel Mauss and more recently Tomasz Strzelecki. Then we'll move on to a semiotic approach and how that informs both space and temporality based on a sort of indigenous empiricism of environmental observation. Following, we'll discuss the seasonal round as a potential economic engine. And while I give a nod to longer distance economic interactions, such as the Salt Trail or those described in some of the origin stories, we will not have time to go into those in detail. Following that, puha, the power to make life happen. Its acquisition, its exchange, and its personification, even in the form of economic agents. Then we will look at how temporality regulates the availability of items and how it relates to that Mount Charleston topology and the cycles of the seasonal round. And then finally, we'll wrap up and tie back together all these principles of emplacement and how they relate to economic interactions between humans, and other than humans, and what the role is of both natural and anthropogenic signs in mediating these exchanges. Our old friend Julian Stewart has perpetuated many of the unfortunate myths that have hampered archaeology of the Southern Great Basin, and yet we cannot do archaeology in this region without him. So this is not a thorough takedown, but just a sampling of quotes of his and some of his colleagues that have been used to hamper these sorts of studies. Quote, the so-called antelope shaman of many Nevada groups who drew game into a corral was apparently unknown to the Coso Range Shoshone. These powers were not portrayed visually. Then, Mr. Stewart, how do you explain, given that Coso is a word derived from the Panamint Shoshone language, the Panamint being synonymous with the Timbisha, This site in Death Valley, where we have a procession of bighorn sheep going straight into a corral, surrounded by people. Or perhaps you would also like to explain this pattern body anthropomorph, by many understood to be an indication of a shaman, that is topped with bighorns. Bighorn horns. Some more misconceptions by Stewart and colleagues. Quote, the Shoshonean subsistence activities have no apparent relations to this art. Pine nuts, sand bunchgrass, or mesquite beans might have entered their magic in art, but apparently this was not the case. Then why, Mr. Stewart, am I seen here providing a condition assessment of a petroglyph site at a site with green cone pine nut harvesting features? And I was not the first to make this observation. Amy Gilreath preceded me in this and published on the association between scratched style petroglyphs and pine nut harvesting. Said Stewart, the Shoshonean Indians constantly verged on starvation. Similarly, Campbell Grant said, their possessions were meager. The endless search for food left little time for an art form, and these people had none. Now, again, we have refuted this, and instead we should take these comments in the context of when Stewart was conducting his initial ethnographic fieldwork during the Depression era among some of the most marginalized communities in the country, who were being forced into assimilation by having their food sources taken away by the federal government. On a more cheery note, we can discuss the multi-tiered Numic world and the chromaticism of the Mount Charleston topology. Simply put, if we imagine the mountain of Mount Charleston divided into 5 zones, with the bottom zone all the way through the top zone associated with a color each. The bottommost one, black, is associated with the underworld and caves, and also with regeneration, the spirit world, and the animal master, in the Kwayusi language called Kiawera. The next level is valley floors, associated with the color red, best exemplified by the word Tumpisa, which is the Timbisha Shoshone word for Death Valley. Moving on up into the alluvial fans, Bahada, foothills, and Piedmont, we get into the sagebrush scrubland and the pinyon juniper forest. All of this associated with blue-green. Above that, and especially above the tree line, we get up into the high mountain terrain associated with the color yellow. And then finally, up at the top, white, the celestial realm, with the snow caps literally in the sky among the clouds. Like I said, I will be avoiding the terms resources and extraction, and instead be attempting to embrace an emic mindset of gifts, requests, and prayer motivating exchange. So acquisition is the result of exchange, not extraction. Some useful economic theoretical work is especially recent work done on social exchange theory and relational contract theory. So we'll be talking about our old friend, Marcel Mauss, and the gift, who gives us the verbiage for the connection between wealth and mana, or in our case, we call that puha. And then more recently, Tomasz Strzelecki, who talks of decision theory and provides some concepts that are useful for applying to hunter-gatherers, such as flexibility versus strategic rationality and temporal lotteries. When I say that we're taking a semiotic approach, that is that people are observing environmental indicators of the landscape and nature as signs, any sort of sign, inclusively. Be that what we see at the top here, which is a rock formation when seen from a certain angle, invokes the image of a mountain lion and a coyote, and thus also brings to mind the oral traditions tied to them, or also to astronomical observations. Turning to Dave Whitley's recount of animal behavior, first with the example of the red flicker visiting his bird feeder the day before snowfall in the Tehachapi Mountains, a regular indicator. And of course, relating this to the association between bighorn sheep and rain. After all, the bighorn sheep rutting season tends to correspond with the Mojave Desert's monsoon season, at the same time that the bighorn sheep are clanging their horns and stomping their hooves, making thunderous sounds. The thunderous storms arrive. It is no accident, then, that this is also the time of year that the constellation Orion re-enters the sky, or to the Timbisha, as well as the Mojave, the three leaping sheep in the sky. So revisiting the seasonal round, we can understand that things are placed in both space and time. To get to where the mountain sheep are, one must also get to when the mountain sheep are. Chris Brosman's master's thesis describes how the seasonal circuit might be marked with petroglyphs at the base of spurs to more upland goods, such as pine nut, hunting grounds, etc. And so we can see these anthropogenic signs help mediate this economic engine by providing indicators of the where and when. We must absolutely talk about puha, its acquisition, exchange, and personification, because puha is something that one can have and possess, and thus is something one can exchange. Puha can also be bestowed upon someone. Puha inherently has agency of its own because it is a life-giving force, and also, especially, but not exclusively, has this agency when it is personified as other than human agents, whether those are spirit helpers providing puha to a vision quester, whether that personification takes the form of the animal master regenerating the big game and enforcing world renewal. Here we see a vein of red ochre, and red ochre can be seen as an example of tracing the movement of puha. Perhaps one leaves as an offering knotted yucca, a prayer knot here in exchange for the ochre, which is then redeposited at pictograph sites, perhaps at vision questing sites, as indicated by this image of Datura. And thus we can trace this movement of puha through material archaeological observations. That puha can also enable the shaman to do things such as open up cracks in the ground where one's cache might be. Some of these cracks are wide enough to use as hunting grounds, while others have goods such as willow, which is described as a material from which one makes baskets in the variant of the origin stories in which Coyote becomes a shaman. And so the shaman has a disproportional influence on the economic engine within this model of time-space systematics. Being able to make the earth open up, being able to control access to the places that provide things such as game animals, certain types of botanical resources, and other non-subsistence goods as well. But one still must meet with the other than human agents, whether those other than human agents are the plants and animals, whether they are the earth, the landscape itself, the place, whether they are the spirit beings or deities such as the animal master. So to recount, economic exchange in hunter-gatherer foraging societies is placed in both time and space. The exchange must happen at a meeting where these things converge. Exchange happens between people and the environment, and between people and other than humans, and is mediated by this unseen, permeating, life-giving force that is puha.